Hello and welcome. This is Jake from Turbulent Media, here to bring you the very first episode of our Turbulence podcast. When I started Mysterious Planet, the intent of that podcast was to explore the mysteries and anomalies of our world and our society. However, a growing desire emerged to broaden the range of topics that can be discussed in Turbulent Media's content. This new Turbulence podcast will fulfill that, where rather than have guests on to discuss mysteries, we'll be bringing you discussions with guests that will touch on the broader topics of the natural world, history, politics, philosophy, and the cosmos. Now, with both Turbulence and Mysterious Planet at the forefront of Turbulent Media's content, I'm confident that Turbulent Media will now be able to touch upon the broadest range of topics, promoting science, political discussion, cosmic exploration, and the spread of ideas that will serve to expand the minds of our audience. Tonight on the first episode of Turbulence, I will be speaking with Peter Ward. He is a world-renowned paleontologist and science writer. We'll be covering a number of topics, including mass extinctions, the future of evolution, the urgent climate change issue, and the future of the human race. So, without further ado, I bring you Peter Ward. All right, everyone, welcome back to the show. We have another awesome guest joining us tonight. He is a paleontologist and science writer, authoring many popular science books. He's also done TED Talks and interviews with Big Think to discuss topics such as mass extinction and climate change. Please welcome Peter Ward. Peter, thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great.
Awesome. All right, so first off, I think a proper way to introduce your expertise to our audience would be to talk about mass extinctions. I understand that you specialize in the Cretaceous extinction event, the Permian extinction event, and mass extinctions generally. This fascination with mass extinctions, how did it start?
You know, it sounds a little grim, doesn't it? I mean, who's going to study mass death and actually make a living out of it? I don't know. I mean, maybe it's the horror movies I grew up on, but there's something really fascinating about periods of time when so much of the world's species just die off. I mean, the murder mysteries are perennially popular, and there's good reason. Who done it? Who killed it? Why did they die? That stuff fascinates us. And you could say mass extinctions are the world's biggest whodunits. So it's pretty cool from that point of view.
Absolutely. So one debate that greatly interests me is the mystery that surrounds the extinction of the Ice Age megamammals. I understand that you've actually written a book on the subject. So in your view, why did the Ice Age megamammals disappear?
Yeah, this is one of the greatest mysteries. And the problem is that, you know, we put so much money and time into studying the death of the dinosaurs and earlier stuff. But this is an extinction that happened 12,000 years ago in North America. So you would think it'd be easy to figure out. And I guess one of the really hard aspects of this whole business, if we cannot figure out what caused 50 species of big mammals to die out in North America just 12,000 years ago, how in the heck can we ever figure out 65 million years ago or 250 million years ago? And yet we have this really still enormous mystery. As you know, there's probably two sides to it. One is climate change. Climate change, we have big mammals, big animals anytime really have narrow limits for survivability. They need food, they need range, they need this and that. But being big is not really a good deal. The only really reason to be big is you can avoid predators. But you need so much food. And the problem with being big in a climate change scenario is the vegetation changes, and you are probably going to have big problems. So possibility number one, the ice ages end. We get the last of the big glacial advances and the retreats. And 12,000 years ago, we get this enormous change in vegetation, and the big mastodons, the mammoths, the glyptodons, the sloths, the big predators, all that stuff dies simply because of vegetation change. That's number one. Number two, though, is the one that's so emotional. It is that 12,000 years ago, North America was invaded by a group of people called the Clovis people, who brought big game hunting technology in the nature of a whole new kind of spear point, about 6 inches long, made out of beautiful carved, broken, opalized flint. These spearheads were the biggest ever to be found by indigenous peoples that had migrated to North America. And the thought is that this huge weapon allowed them to rip apart in a new way. And so we've got climate change versus humans did it. And you really start running into a lot of cultural pushback when you say that the forerunners of the North American indigenous peoples, the people before the Europeans invaded this, killed off so many mammals. I mean, that's really an indictment that nobody wants to hear. But nevertheless, you really get this sense that we have this big murder mystery, and having those murder weapons associated with dead mastodons, mammoths, we find these spear points stuck in their ribs. Come on now, there's some of this killing that's going on. The problem is, after all these years, and I wrote that book 20 years ago, there is still no consensus. And we're going back, probably the combination. I mean, that was major climate change. But there ain't no doubt that there were a lot of people rushing into North America with a brand new technology. One of the studies that really struck me as the most interesting is that we think of mass extinctions as happening really fast, right? Bang, down goes the meteorite, deep impact, Armageddon, boom. What if you had 500 years and these new weapons appear, and over 500 years, you start killing off just 2% more of the babies, baby mastodons, mammoths, than would otherwise have died out? And if you do the math, there are never many elephants anywhere. You kill off 2% extra than would have otherwise died from natural processes. You kill them all off in about 700 years. I mean, it's really simple. And I think these early people, they were smart. They're not going to go after the gigantic ones. Instead, they're going after the babies. And this really does seem like a really interesting scenario. A friend of mine, Dan Fisher from Michigan, he studies mammoth tusks. And it turns out that when mammoths produce babies, the female mammoths, to get enough calcium for the bones, they start re-eroding their own bones and the tusks themselves. And they take calcium carbonate out of it because they're building this gigantic baby elephant in their womb. If you start having this removal of calcium carbonate, you can study the tusks, and it's been asked, did we see evidence that in fact there was an increased number of babies being born? And in fact there were. There's no indication that they were dying of starvation. There's every indication that more and more and more of these babies were being born simply because they're being wiped out. So there is really pretty good clues that in fact humans had some to this puzzle.
Gotcha. What about the I recently saw an article a few months ago. They were deciphering hieroglyphics at the Göbekli Tepe site in Turkey. And these hieroglyphs told of a massive cataclysm that occurred on Earth around 12,000 years ago. Basically, the hypothesis that, we were hit by a comet, the heat generated by this basically set the globe on fire, melted the 2-mile thick ice sheets, and because of the positioning of the ice caps, we see a massive extinction of mega mammals in North America, but Africa retained a lot of its mega mammals. What are your thoughts on that hypothesis? Is there merit to that, or is this pseudoscience? Because I know a lot of people such as Randall Carlson, Graham Hancock, who people a lot of times consider to be very pseudoscientific. They support this theory. Do you think it has merit?
Well, it's interesting because previously that suggestion was made for North America. Because about 12,000 years ago in the North American plains and the Midwest, there has been found this charcoal layer. And beneath it, you find the big bones, and above it, some of these are already extinct. Interestingly, North America has shown evidence that maybe a similar catastrophe has at least been theorized. The problem being is that we find the extinction of the big mammals and mastodons and mammoths, all that stuff is taking place not exactly at the same time everywhere, but kind of sequentially. And a lot of people, I mean, really, some National Academy of Science people from North America have suggested that indeed we were hit by a big asteroid 12,000 years ago, and that this really could explain both those data sets from the old world and the new. And yet, we find remains of these things after that supposed event. There's such good evidence that the dinosaurs were largely killed off by asteroid impact, and yet for this late Pleistocene event, it's nowhere near as compelling. I mean, it's fascinating. There's something going on here that begs explanation, and that's the beauty thing about science, is that, I mean, that's one of these mysteries, gets people out looking, you can get funds, but I've not, to date, I've not really been convinced that it was large impact that produced this extinction. Stuff existed after that 12,000 years ago. If it was an impact, certainly it wasn't globally catastrophic.
Gotcha. So you're saying because there's more of a gradual extinction rather than a poof, everything's gone.
Yeah, and again, because it's happened so recently, I mean, you expect the data to be really clean where it's such a rapid extinction, but it's not. It's almost like it makes more sense 65 million years ago when it's so long ago. I mean, the time scales are so hard to differentiate when it's such ancient rock. And yet you would think if that had happened 12,000 years ago, the evidence would be so compelling, but it's not. I mean, it's still to be determined. And this is what spooks me a little bit. I mean, we should have really firm evidence where there are really large body impact causing that much extinction so recently.
How close are we to kind of unraveling the mystery in completion?
Well, the beauty is that this is such a fascinating question that new people going into the field will gravitate to it. And I think as we move along, I mean, part of it was years ago, this cultural aspect that local people could have caused this. I mean, that there was some feedback and kickback to that was such that a lot of people didn't really want to get involved because it's controversial. I mean, for instance, in Hawaii, for instance, when the first peoples arrived there was a massive bird extinction. And yet, when I was in Hawaii and I was writing one of my early books, I mean, the local peoples didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to go there. And they would say, oh, no, I mean, really, no, we had nothing to do with this. And one of the things that struck me is that when you go to beautiful Hawaii and you see the road signs, we have in Washington State, we have some sort of logo for the state. But the logo in Hawaii is King Kamehameha in this beautiful orange cloak. And the orange cloak was made from about 1,000 tiny little birds that had red plumage. So they're killing like 1,000 birds per cloak, and yet saying that we had nothing to do with the extinction of all these birds. Well,
right.
Humans are big creatures, and when you get big creatures that run into really fragile ecosystems, stuff dies off.
Right. Yeah. We are very much almost like a virus in that sense, that we just consume everything that we come across.
Well, we're big people. And the other aspect, we love our kids. And then when you're a parent, you start asking, what would you do to keep your kid alive? And the answer is, well, anything.
Right.
Who do I have to kill? What do I have to kill? Last bird? Oh, okay. See ya.
Exactly. That's a very good point. So we're talking about extinctions here. I'd like to move from the Pleistocene extinction into a more kind of general area. So, I mean, if we take a look at Earth's past, we see a remarkably reliable pattern of mass extinctions. I mean, you've got the Permian mass extinction, the extinctions that led from Triassic to Jurassic, Jurassic to Cretaceous. I mean, there's an eerily reliable pattern of these mass extinctions throughout our planet's history. What do these mass extinctions all have in common, and what can these mass extinctions of the past tell us about a possible future mass extinction?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I think the first part you're asking, is there a regularity to them? And this has been one of the hottest topics in my field for years, was there a cyclicity? Was there... And Ralph and Sapkowski years ago, two University of Chicago paleontologists, suggested that every 26 million years we had one of these mass extinctions. And once you talk about regularity, you ask, well, how could that be? And that really caused people to start asking, is it something of the Earth or something from above the Earth? And we got this idea that there's a cyclicity and extinction from extraterrestrial causes. Could it be that as we go around the big merry-go-round of the galaxy, and that our sun is moving around this big pinwheel, that there are times when our sun is moving through celestial areas that are perhaps more dangerous, perhaps there's gravitation, perhaps we're going closer to other suns, but are we kicking up extra, say, meteorite, comet impacts? And so this was the explanation for a while. But the mathematics of periodicity and extinctions has not held up. I mean, as more and more models are starting to be looked at and better data, this whole idea of every 26 million years just doesn't seem to hold up. Secondly, there was the idea up till about the year 2000 that with the great paradigm shift of the Alvarez extinction hypothesis in 1980, that not just the KT, not just the dinosaur killer, but maybe all of the big 5 mass extinctions were caused by impact. I mean, this is great times for me. I got to go out to these places all over the Earth and look at lots of areas in different times looking for evidence of impact, and it wasn't found. So instead, what we're finding is that it is Earth-borne causes. It is huge volcanic events that seem to have caused 4 of the so-called big 5 mass extinctions. And there really isn't a regularity to the Earth spewing out this enormous amount of volcanic material that creates the CO2, the greenhouse gases that were really the mechanism causing the death in these mass extinctions. So you have a heartbeat in the Earth, all right, but it's not beating at some sort of cyclicity. It's really more related to plate tectonics, continents ripping apart, continents coming together, and various aspects of what we call continental assembly supercycles. Seem to be times when greater amounts of volcanic material cause rapid global warming. Now, moving to the present, are we moving into a current mass extinction? If we have 4 of the past 5 big mass extinctions being caused by rapid carbon dioxide, what is it that we're doing to our planet today? How could there not be a parallel to it? And I think that is really the most powerful and important of explanations around.
Absolutely. The extinction of the dinosaurs, then, we're always told that, it's this comet strike, asteroid the size of Mount Everest, hit the Earth, blocked out the sun for, hundreds of thousands of years. Is that an outdated theory?
No, it's not outdated in the least. And the beautiful thing is, today, I'm just 1 week away from flying off to Gubbio, Italy, for a celebration of the study of that. That was in 1980, but here we are in 2017, and the Geological Society of America is sending a bunch of us back to Gubbio to celebrate actually just the powerfulness of that particular theory. But what we're finding more and more is we have, at the same time as that impact, these enormous flood basalts in India, the Deccan Traps. And so it just seems, wow, what a coincidence that we had this big impact, yet at the same time we also had these enormous volcanic extrusions that produce CO2 as well. And there's an increasing idea that perhaps the impact itself caused enormous shock waves to exactly the opposite side of the planet from the Yucatan where it hit, causing this Indian extrusion of enormous magma. That's a very cool idea. You get hit so hard that you're causing this great big pimple of volcanic stuff to come extruding out, adding to the whole extinction aspect. So it's really vibrant. It still works, but there's also, to me, extremely troubling aspects. I mean, if we can go current in this podcast, the most important really aspect that the KT extinction hypothesis ever generated came from Carl Sagan. The concept of nuclear winter. Dinosaurs did not die out from pieces of rock bouncing off that crater. I mean, they weren't knocked over by stuff falling back in the sky. They were killed off by 6 months of utter darkness from all the ash and all the material and all the rock thrown up from that huge titanic explosion. Carl Sagan took that concept, 6 months of darkness, and asked, How else could you produce 6 months of darkness? Full-scale nuclear exchange could do that. The question now is we are facing what looks like an increasingly fragile world. We're seeing threat from the North Korean conflict. We're seeing the aspect of limited nuclear war, increasingly the saber rattling. How many nukes blown up will cause, again, nuclear winter? And this is, I think, is an extremely relevant question right now. I mean, it used to be there would be the Russians and the Americans throwing everything they had. But what if we had 5? What if we had 10? What if we had a small-scale exchange? But we've never blown up more than one nuclear explosion at a time ever in the past, really big ones. And we talk the American test, the Russian test, one at a time. And if we had 10 at a time. So this is where geology really, I think, informs us. And people are beginning to model how much nuclear winter could we get from a limited exchange. And I think, again, this is the relevance of any paleontology to the present day.
That seems to be something that a lot of people don't realize about the extinction of the dinosaurs. It's like, they weren't killed upon impact. It was a very slow, drawn out death, with the vegetation dying and the herbivores dying, and then the herbivores, the predators that preyed upon the herbivores starving as well. I mean, and it does have merit in this modern day. I mean, it is quite scary.
Well, it is scary. And the other aspect is, why are we not speaking more and more about climate change at the moment? The end-Permian extinction was caused by really rapid runaway greenhouse gases. We are now producing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at a higher rate, a faster rate than caused the most radical, catastrophic mass extinction in history. We are producing CO2 faster than the Permian extinction. And yet we're finding that the mainstream media, less and less do you see indications. I mean, we just had 2 enormous hurricanes. I mean, look what happened to Houston. All of the air was sucked out of that Houston catastrophe by the Florida catastrophe. How can you say that all of the CO2 we are letting into the atmosphere did not lead to those 2 catastrophes? I mean, it's just nonsensical that climate change has no traction to the extent that it did even 5 years ago.
Absolutely. The debate, I noticed too, is becoming quite frustrating. I mean, it's like, because you have on CNN, you have someone like Bill Nye. You have somebody on there who, I don't even want to say believes in climate change, because at this point it's hard to deny the evidence. You have someone who supports the idea that man-made climate change is happening and is urgent. And then you have somebody on who says no, and this gives it the illusion that both sides have equal merit. That's what that's what frustrates me so much about this debate.
You're absolutely right. Journalism is that there are always 2 sides. But a word you just said is something, again, that shouldn't really be involved with science. You said belief. I mean, believes in climate change. No, I mean, science is supported or not supported. Belief has nothing to do with it. I mean, belief is about religion to me. But support or lack of support is what we talk about in science. I know Bill Nye well. He's a good friend of mine. But Bill Nye, it is a statement about science in this country. Bill Nye is not a scientist. Bill Nye was a trained comedian on Seattle television,
right,
who was mantle of being the spokesman for American science. And it is just another really indictment of how poorly our society is dealing with the most important issues, which are scientific. And it's only science that can really give us an understanding that we can get to solutions.
Absolutely. So I understand that you've written a book about the future of evolution on Earth, which I find to be a really fascinating topic of discussion. Could you go into detail about your hypotheses in regards to the future of evolution on our planet, from the near future to the distant future? I figured this is probably a good place to segue into that conversation, considering we're talking about the possible end of the world in regards to massive amounts of climate change.
Sure. Well, there's been a couple of funny, supposedly, successful books. A guy named Dougal Dixon, 25 years ago, wrote a book called After Man. It's funny, where he never talked about after women, but it was after man, right? Because men were the human species. And then there was a book 10 years ago by a very successful author called The World Without Us. And this latter book sold millions of copies. It made him a multimillionaire. I met him. His ego was out of control. I'm so important. But it's ridiculous. I mean, to think that the world goes on, that humans get eliminated, but all the other species are there. My sense is that we and the viruses and the bacteria will be the last creature standing, and we'll be the only ones standing. But, I mean, we're so good with our technology that even if we gas the planet, even if we get the oceans to go completely in oxygen, we get hydrogen sulfide, we can make gas masks, we can put clothes on, take them off. It's not that we're going to be happy, but I think we are going to survive. And when you try to think of all the future of evolution with cool animals and the strange stuff, and yet you try to portray it as all the humans are gone, but here's all the cool stuff that evolves after humans are gone. Why would humans ever be gone? I mean, if you think about it, we are so tough, we're so resilient, and we're so good at technology. How do we go extinct? Even with a big impactor. We're going to have the technology soon to get our eggs and sperm off planet. And once that is done, we're indestructible. I mean, to me, the only reason to have a space program, there's no reason to colonize Mars. I mean, it'd be a lot cheaper to colonize the deepest part of the Marianas Trench than colonizing Mars. It's nonsensical. But it makes every bit of sense to put on robotic, big creches, if you will, where we have frozen sperm, eggs, embryos, that we have lots of species, including humans, that if we are hit by, say, a Hale-Bopp-sized comet, we have some way to resurrect and bring life back to this planet. But once we can get off in such a way that humans really are pretty indestructible. But again, there's a big difference between being indestructible and being happy. And I see the misery coming to the next century for what we're doing to the climate as, to me, sad. I mean, more than sad, tragic.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's almost like we're heading towards a Children of Men scenario. I don't know if you've seen that movie, but
sure, Clive Owen was great, but I think that's the wrong thing. I think what we're heading for is sea level rise happening so rapidly that we start doing, do we save this? Do we save Venice? Do we save San Francisco? What do we save? What do we pay for? Or do we pay for people who are starving in various parts? I mean, what is it that a limited amount of money on the planet is going to save? And that's what we're going for. We are going for some idea of there's only a finite amount of resources on this planet. Sea level is going to be the single greatest disruptor of human civilization in the next 500 years, because you see this idea, oh my gosh, it's going to be 5 feet by 2100, but then it's going to stop, right? Magically.
Right.
I mean, once those ice caps and ice sheets start going, it becomes asymptotic. And then you've saved so much in the 2100s, and then they come the 2200s, and now it's gone 10 feet, and then it's 20 feet. Oh my God, what cities? You keep putting cities further in higher elevation. I mean, that's really an awful scenario, and that can be stopped.
Right.
If we shape energy policies, if we stop putting CO2 in the atmosphere, we have a chance to stop this.
It seems like a lot of what I hear is like, oh, you know, humans are just going to bite it in 100 years. I mean, for some reason, an interview with Stephen King sticks out in my mind where someone asks him, how do you think we're going to be consuming novels in 100 years? And he says, well, if there's a human race in 100 years. So that's interesting because we always just have this idea that, you know, humans are going to go extinct. They're going to go extinct quick, and then, you know, the animals are going to take back the planet, you know. And so if that's not the case and we live on, I guess my first question is, what animals survive along with us? What animals are similarly resilient to us?
Well, the first thing you have to ask is not animals will survive along with us, but what animals do we need to survive along with us? And the first thing you need among all else is nitrifying bacteria. You've got to have microbes that are working on the roots of plants, or you're not going to have plants. You've got to have bees, you've got to have pollinators, you've got to have a huge number of microbial species that can keep soil doing what it's doing. You need to have food crops, you need to have all this stuff. I mean, do we need elephants and giraffes? No. But we've got to have, I mean, we are the most selfish species that has been around for a long time. So we need the stuff to keep us being fed. And that is the stuff that if you think of taking a colony ship to the stars, you've got to have some stuff with you to make sure humans survive. So that's the stuff that survives first. And then after that is the stuff that's really clever. And I think among the most clever of crows, of course, are crows, rats, rodents, all the creatures that can live in cities. When I wrote the book Future Evolution, I proposed that there are two major biotic habitats for the next 2 centuries, the cities and agricultural fields. Because with ever more people, you need more food, and you're going to have bigger and greater fields, and we're going to have mega cities. The two types of creatures that live in cities and fields, they're the winners.
Gotcha. So it's basically the vermin that survives. It's the vermin that...
Vermin? Tell a snake vermin. I mean, tell a rat is vermin. Rats are beautiful. I've had a lot of people that have pet rats. I've had gerbils. I mean, they think we're the vermin. I mean, we're the vermin. The beautiful rats are not the vermin. They're just, like, very clever. I live in this house in the country, and I shared it with rats last year. It's uncomfortable living with rats, but I mean, there's not a lot you can do about it unless you poison the hell out of them, and then you're poisoning yourself.
Right. Basically what I meant by that is it's animals that depend on cities and that depend on basically livestock and you said you use the term agricultural land.
Oh, sure. The livestock itself. I mean,
right.
If you look, here's the coolest deal, and you're asking me about books. I've just finished a new book, and it's about epigenetics. Epigenetics is this really interesting new idea about how evolution works. Heritable epigenetics, which is a change in your genome by something you've done in your life. Darwin said that's impossible. It's quite possible. So how did we get after the mass extinction so many species so quickly? Darwinian evolution is always slow. This is why the creationists have always made hay, because Darwinian evolution cannot explain the rapid evolution after mass extinctions, but there's all new ideas about how to do this. But the most rapid evolution is going to take place within the next few decades, and it is going to be caused by CRISPR-Cas9. And if you have not had a podcast on CRISPR-Cas9, you ought to. This is the brand new genetic method where you can substitute and put in brand new genes. And Americans, for the first time ever, used CRISPR-Cas9 to put a brand novel gene into a human embryo. Now, the ostensible reason to do this is you could wipe out these horrible genetic diseases, because a lot of these poor kids that have these terrible genetic maladies, there's only one gene that's screwed up. So you can knock that out with CRISPR and put a whole new one in. But it's being used now to make supposedly better food. They've made mushrooms that don't go dead in the supermarket. Don't you hate it? You buy those expensive mushrooms and 3 days later they're turning black and they've got those little, they just change. No. What had a gene that made those things last longer, you make more money.
Right.
The problem is genes can jump. And when genes jump, bad things can happen. So the future of evolution is going to be humans messing with agricultural crops, escaping into other species. So we've got a whole new world of new species that are about to appear in the next century, from mainly, I can't say the word F-U-C-K, but mostly screw-ups. I mean...
Go ahead, it doesn't matter.
Screw-ups from people trying to make money and escaping genes that absolutely screw up things. And this is the future of evolution, I see.
Gotcha.
Woof. I mean, look at this. Here's my beautiful creature dog. Hey, Sammy, say hi. I mean, oops, are you still there? Did I turn you off?
No, you're there.
Oh, no. It's just when you look, what is the most rapid evolution we've seen? And recently, it's domestic chickens. But if you look at dogs, I mean, how rapidly has evolution been in dogs in the last 1,000 years?
Right.
These breeds and stuff, and we've done it through some really extraordinary ways. So the future of evolution is in human hands.
Gotcha. I think I read something of yours too, and you said that basically, because I've done some research into this, and basically, you mentioned creationists, and a lot of the ways they try to attack evolution is like, Darwin was wrong about certain things, or they say, you guys basically worship Darwin. Darwin's book is like your Bible. And it's like, no, Darwin got almost everything about biology correct, but most of what he said about genetics was flat wrong. And I think I read something of yours that basically said the insane amounts of dog breeds that we get, what we've done to the dog genome, basically disproves a lot of what Darwin said about genetics.
Well, Darwin, there was no idea about DNA. They didn't know what genes were. He knew there was some sort of heritable particle. But you got to give Darwin a pass on a lot of this. This is science that happened well after him. But again, this whole, I think, revolution that is called epigenetics is a new layer to the theory of evolution. It's not going to turn over evolution. It's just adding on more new knowledge. But we do know that some of these methods of rapid evolution probably are related to this epigenetic rather than the random chance mutation that Darwin thought. Just the fact that you could get some creatures happening so quickly, and you can't explain it by random mutation, but these epigeneticists are actually able to explain a lot of this, and in such a way. But the frightening thing is that a lot of aspects of past human history seem to be affected by this mechanism too. The scariest one is the Dutch winter, the Dutch hunger of 1945. The Nazis starved Holland. Starved to the point that you couldn't find shoes that had the leather because people had eaten the shoe leather. Oh. This was starvation beyond belief. And the people that were starved, they produced children that had two major characteristics. Either they became just complete gluttons and hugely obese, or they became like Audrey Hepburn, these tiny, skinny little waifs. And all her life, she had intestinal problems. She couldn't eat. She'd throw it back up. Really skinny. This was because her parents were starved. But the starvation of her parents affected their genomes in a way that Darwin said could not happen, but did happen. The great starvations, but even worse, soldiers. When you put a guy in combat or a woman in combat, the effect and the stress of that is increasingly, it looks like violence is also creating these epigenetic changes. We need a generation without a war. Every generation we seem to have one. We need to break that cycle because it's not the soldiers that are so broken, but it's the children that they have. But let me tell you, you might sign me up for a whole hour about epigenetics, because I'll tell you, that's the revolution. That's what we're coming at.
Gotcha. Peter, I really appreciate you coming on the show. And if we could do another session, there's a lot more I'd love to get to.
Yeah, that's good. I'd love to see it. And again, I'm here for you. Guys like you, no one ever gets thanked enough. I'm thanking you for doing this.
Hey, no problem.
All right. All the best then. See you later.
All right, all the best. Come back anytime.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, bye. For everyone listening on YouTube or on our website, please be sure to check the video description for a list of Peter Ward's publications. As always, I'd greatly appreciate you spreading the word about the show and sharing this on social media, if you're so inclined. If you enjoy our content and would like to see it become greater in quality and quantity, you may perhaps consider becoming a patron of Turbulent Media at www.patreon.com/turbulentmedia. You can find a link in the video description for that. Every little donation helps and will guarantee that Turbulent Media will soon be able to begin hosting events and debates, as well as producing documentaries in the same vein as Planet Earth and Cosmos. Once again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us on Turbulence. I look forward to having many more fascinating guests on the show and possibly expand into hosting debates on the show as well. I hope to see you all on the next episode. Thanks again for joining us. All right, everyone, welcome back to the show. We have another awesome guest joining us tonight. He is a paleontologist and science writer, authoring many popular science books. He's also done TED Talks and interviews with Big Think to discuss topics such as mass extinction and climate change. Please welcome Peter Ward. Peter, thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great.
Awesome. All right, so first off, I think a proper way to introduce your expertise to our audience would be to talk about mass extinctions. I understand that you specialize in the Cretaceous extinction event, the Permian extinction event, and mass extinctions generally. This fascination with mass extinctions, how did it start?
You know, it sounds a little grim, doesn't it? I mean, who's going to study mass death and actually make a living out of it? I don't know. I mean, maybe it's the horror movies I grew up on, but there's something really fascinating about periods of time when so much of the world's species just die off. I mean, murder mysteries are perennially popular, and there's good reason. Who done it? Who killed it? Why did they die? That stuff fascinates us. And you could say mass extinctions are the world's biggest whodunits. So it's pretty cool from that point of view.
Absolutely. So one debate that greatly interests me is the mystery that surrounds the extinction of the Ice Age megamammals. I understand that you've actually written a book on the subject. So in your view, why did the Ice Age megamammals disappear?
Yeah, this is one of the greatest mysteries. And the problem is that, you know, we put so much money and time into studying the death of the dinosaurs and earlier stuff. But this is an extinction that happened 12,000 years ago in North America. So you would think it'd be easy to figure out. And I guess one of the really hard aspects of this whole business, if we cannot figure out what caused 50 species of big mammals to die out in North America just 12,000 years ago, how in the heck can we ever figure out 65 million years ago or 250 million years ago? And yet we have this really still enormous mystery. As you know, there's probably two sides to it. One is climate change. Climate change, we have big mammals, big animals anytime really have narrow limits for survivability. They need food, they need range, they need this and that. But being big is not really a good deal. The only really reason to be big is you can avoid predators. But you need so much food. And the problem with being big in a climate change scenario is the vegetation changes, and you are probably going to have big problems. So possibility number one, the ice ages end. We get the last of the big glacial advances and the retreats. And 12,000 years ago, we get this enormous change in vegetation, and the big mastodons, the mammoths, the glyptodons, the sloths, the big predators, all that stuff dies simply because of vegetation change. That's number one. Number two, though, is the one that's so emotional. It is that 12,000 years ago, North America was invaded by a group of people called the Clovis people, who brought big game hunting technology in the nature of a whole new kind of spear point, about 6 inches long, made out of beautiful carved, broken, opalized flint. These spearheads were the biggest ever to be found by indigenous peoples that had migrated to North America. And the thought is that this huge weapon allowed them to rip apart in a new way. And so we've got climate change versus humans did it. And you really start running into a lot of cultural pushback when you say that the forerunners of the North American indigenous peoples, the people before the Europeans invaded this, killed off.
Hello and welcome. This is Jake from Turbulent Media, here to bring you the very first episode of our Turbulence podcast. When I started Mysterious Planet, the intent of that podcast was to explore the mysteries and anomalies of our world and our society. However, a growing desire emerged to broaden the range of topics that can be discussed in Turbulent Media's content. This new Turbulence podcast will fulfill that, where rather than have guests on to discuss mysteries, we'll be bringing you discussions with guests that will touch on the broader topics of the natural world, history, politics, philosophy, and the cosmos. Now, with both Turbulence and Mysterious Planet at the forefront of Turbulent Media's content, I'm confident that Turbulent Media will now be able to touch upon the broadest range of topics, promoting science, political discussion, cosmic exploration, and the spread of ideas that will serve to expand the minds of our audience. Tonight on the first episode of Turbulence, I will be speaking with Peter Ward. He is a world-renowned paleontologist and science writer. We'll be covering a number of topics, including mass extinctions, the future of evolution, the urgent climate change issue, and the future of the human race. So, without further ado, I bring you Peter Ward.
So many mammals. I mean, that's really an indictment that nobody wants to hear. But nevertheless, you really get this sense that we have this big murder mystery, and having those murder weapons associated with dead mastodons, mammoths, we find these spear points stuck in their ribs. Come on now, there's some of this killing that's going on. The problem is, after all these years, and I wrote that book 20 years ago, there is still no consensus. And we're going back, probably the combination. I mean, that was major climate change. But there ain't no doubt that there were a lot of people rushing into North America with a brand new technology. One of the studies that really struck me as the most interesting is that we think of mass extinctions as happening really fast, right? Bang, down goes the meteorite, deep impact, Armageddon, boom. What if you had 500 years? And these new weapons appear, and over 500 years, you start killing off just 2% more of the babies, baby mastodons, mammoths, than would otherwise have died out. And if you do the math, there are never many elephants anywhere. You kill off 2% extra than would have otherwise died from natural processes. You kill them all off in about 700 years. I mean, it's really simple, and I think these early people, they were smart. They're not going to go after the gigantic ones. Instead, they're going after the babies. And this really does seem